Between the years 1500 and 1866, over 12 million African men, women, and children were torn from their homelands and forced across the Atlantic Ocean. But here's what they don't tell you in most history books. 2 million never made it across. They died in the darkness of ship holds, their bodies thrown into the ocean like cargo. This wasn't just theft. This was the systematic destruction of entire civilizations, the depopulation of kingdoms, the erasure of knowledge systems that had existed for millennia. But the story you're about to hear isn't just about suffering, it's about resistance. It's about how African people fought back, how they survived, how they preserved their humanity against impossible odds. This is the story they tried to bury. This is the Atlantic slave trade, and its consequences echo through Africa to this very day. Welcome to Africa Hidden History. I'm your narrator, and today we are confronting one of the darkest chapters in human history, but we are telling it from an African perspective. For too long, the story of the Atlantic slave trade has been told through European eyes. We hear about plantation economies, about shipping routes, about the profits made in Liverpool and Lisbon. But what about the kingdoms that were destroyed? What about the families torn apart? What about the demographic catastrophe that changed Africa's trajectory forever? Today's documentary will take you on a journey spanning 4 centuries. We'll walk through the magnificent kingdoms of West and Central Africa before European contact. We'll witness the arrival of the Portuguese in the 1440s and watch as a trickle of captives becomes a flood of humanity. We'll follow the stories of real African people, kings who resisted, warriors who fought back, captives who rebelled on slave ships, and communities that rebuilt themselves despite everything. But most importantly, we'll reveal the hidden truths. The African resistance movements that fought the trade for centuries, the economic systems that were deliberately destroyed, the demographic collapse that some regions still haven't recovered from 6 centuries later. By the end of this documentary, you understand not just what happened, but why it matters today, why some African nations struggle with development, why certain regions have gender imbalances, why cultural knowledge was lost, and why understanding this history is crucial for understanding modern Africa. This is not a story of victimhood. This is a story of resilience, resistance, and survival against the greatest crime in human history. Let's begin. To understand what was lost, you must first understand what existed. In the 1400s, before European ships appeared on the Atlantic coast, Africa was home to some of the world's most sophisticated civilizations. The Mali Empire controlled the trans-Saharan gold trade. Timbuktu hosted one of the world's largest universities with over 25,000 students. The Sankore Mosque held hundreds of thousands of manuscripts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and law. Along the West African coast, the Kingdom of Benin had perfected bronze casting techniques that Europeans couldn't replicate. Their capital city, according to Dutch visitors, was larger and better organized than Amsterdam. The streets were wide and straight. The palace complex covered an area larger than many European cities. Further south, the Kingdom of Congo was a centralized state with a sophisticated administrative system. They had a written language, a currency system, and diplomatic relations stretching across Central Africa. On the East African coast, Swahili city-states like Kilwa and Mombasa traded with Arabia, India, and China. They used their own currency, built multi-story buildings from coral stone, and wrote poetry in Kiswahili. Africa's economy in the 15th century was diverse and interconnected. The trans-Saharan trade routes carried gold, salt, ivory, and enslaved people northward. But this slavery was fundamentally different from what was coming. In African societies, slavery was usually temporary. Enslaved people could own property, marry free people, and their children were often born free. It was a social status, not a permanent racial category. Many rose to positions of power, generals, advisors, even rulers. Most Africans weren't involved in slavery at all. They were farmers growing millet, yams, and rice, fishermen on rivers and coasts, metal workers crafting tools and weapons, weavers creating intricate textiles, traders moving goods across vast networks. The population was growing, cities were expanding, knowledge systems were developing. Africa was on its own historical trajectory until Europe arrived and changed everything. To understand why the Atlantic slave trade began, we must look at Europe in the 1400s. Portugal, a small kingdom on Europe's western edge, was obsessed with finding a sea route to Asia. They wanted to bypass the Muslim-controlled Mediterranean trade and access the spices, silks, and gold of the East. Starting in the 1420s, Portuguese sailors began exploring the West African coast. At first, they were looking for gold and a way around Africa to reach India. But in 1444, something changed. A Portuguese raiding party captured 12 Africans from the coast of Mauritania and brought them back to Portugal. Prince Henry the Navigator realized he'd found a new commodity. African captives could be sold in European markets. They could work on new sugar plantations being established on Atlantic islands like Madeira and São Tomé. This is crucial to understand. The demand for the enslaved labor came first from sugar. Sugar was like oil in our time, an incredibly valuable commodity that Europe craved. Growing sugar required intense labor in brutal conditions. European workers died in large numbers or simply refused to do it. The Portuguese tried enslaving Guanche people from the Canary Islands. They resisted too effectively. They tried the European convicts and poor people, not enough of them. They needed a large renewable source of labor from people who couldn't easily escape back home. They found it in Africa, and once the formula was established, manufactured goods shipped to Africa, enslaved people shipped to the Americas, sugar and other goods shipped back to Europe. The triangle of death was complete. But the Atlantic slave trade truly exploded after 1492, when Christopher Columbus reached the Americas. The Spanish conquistadors quickly enslaved indigenous peoples to work in mines and plantations. Within 50 years, over 90% of the indigenous population of the Caribbean and parts of Central and South America had died from European diseases, overwork, and violence. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had no immunity to smallpox, measles, and typhus. Entire civilizations collapsed. The Spanish and Portuguese still wanted their gold and silver from American mines. They still wanted sugar from Caribbean plantations. They needed to replace the indigenous workers who had died. They turned to Africa. This is the twisted logic of the Atlantic slave trade. One genocide created the demand for another. The demographic catastrophe in the Americas created a demographic catastrophe in Africa. And unlike the diseases that killed indigenous Americans, the slave trade would last for 400 years. By 1500, the stage was set for the greatest forced migration in human history. European powers, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, Britain, France, Denmark, Sweden, would build over 40 coastal forts along West Africa's coast. These weren't just trading posts, they were prisons holding cells where captured Africans waited in dungeons before being loaded onto ships. The Atlantic slave trade would eventually drain captives from a vast region, from Senegambia in the northwest to Angola in the southwest, from the Bight of Benin to the Bight of Biafra, and from Central Africa's interior to the Atlantic coast. Over the next 366 years, This trade would remove at least 12.5 million people from Africa, and perhaps as many as 20 million when you count those who died during capture on the march to the coast or in the Costa prisons. The consequences would reshape Africa forever. The Atlantic slave trade wasn't run by one nation. It was an international operation with different European powers dominating different periods. Portugal pioneered the trade in the 1440s and controlled it for over a century. They established the first coastal forts, developed the ship designs, and created the brutal logistics of transporting human cargo across oceans. Britain became the dominant slave trading nation in the 18th century, transporting over 3 million Africans, more than any other country. British ships were so numerous that they developed a horrific efficiency, packing more people into less space to maximize profits. France, the Netherlands, Spain, Denmark, and Sweden all participated, competing for contracts to supply enslaved Africans to different American colonies. But these nations didn't simply raid African coasts and capture people themselves. That was too dangerous and too costly. They needed African partners. This is one of the most controversial and painful aspects of the slave trade. Some African rulers and merchants participated in capturing and selling other Africans. But context matters enormously. Let's be very clear. European demand created the market. Europeans provided the ships, set the prices, and controlled the ultimate destination. They introduced guns and gunpowder, which created military imbalances. They deliberately fostered conflicts between African states to ensure a steady supply of captives. Some African kingdoms, like Dahomey, became heavily involved in the slave trade. The Kingdom of Dahomey captured people through military raids and sold them to European traders. Their economy became dependent on the trade. By the 18th century, they were exporting thousands of people annually. The Aro Confederacy in what's now Nigeria controlled a vast network of trade routes.